Hey friends, tonight we're wandering into another quiet corner of the world's storytelling, a legend that has been whispered for centuries. You may have heard a version of it before, in a book, a film, or perhaps by a fire on a cool evening, but every telling leaves something behind, and every listener imagines it a little differently. So before we begin, find a comfortable place to rest, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, let the day slowly loosen its grip. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into timeless tales, you're always welcome to subscribe gently at your own pace. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. Now take a slow, steady breath. Let's step softly into a story that has crossed oceans, slipped through centuries, and still lingers in the quiet spaces of imagination. You might picture the image of a dragon as something immediately recognizable, a long body, scales glistening in imagined torchlight, wings spread wide, perhaps breathing fire across a battlefield or curled around a mountain hoard of gold. Yet this is not a single image but a tapestry stitched together from thousands of years of storytelling. When you look at the dragon as it appears in different places and times, you begin to see not one beast but many. In China, a dragon stretches like a river current through the sky, sinuous and without wings, more akin to a snake or a carp than to any lizard or bat. In Europe, a dragon crouches in caverns, heavy and reptilian, a dangerous animal with claws and horns. In the ancient Near East, it sometimes appears as a hybrid form, part lion, part serpent, part bird, each limb belonging to a different creature. So when one thinks of dragons, it is not really one image but a whole cloud of associations, changing depending on where the tale was told, and by whom. The roots of these stories reach far into antiquity, and one can almost trace them like a long vine through the gardens of civilization. The Mesopotamians told of Tiamat, a vast sea dragon, whose body was split by the god Marduk to form the heavens and the earth. That tale, preserved in fragments of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, suggests that the concept of the dragon was not just about monsters, but also about cosmic structure. A creature so vast, so threatening, was folded into the very creation of the world. If you imagine life along the rivers of Mesopotamia, where floods could sweep away whole villages and storms could darken the skies without warning, the dragon's shape begins to make sense as an embodiment of chaos, danger, and power beyond human control. The people writing these myths might have seen great snakes coiling along the riverbanks or crocodiles lurking in the reeds, and then extended those impressions into something larger, something cosmic. From there, if you look westward, you find the Greeks also wrestling with dragon-like figures, though their terminology differed. The word drakon, in ancient Greek, meant a large serpent, often one that was keen-eyed or glancing. It comes from a root that means to see, and many of their dragons are guardians of treasures or sacred sites. Think of the serpent guarding the golden fleece in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, or the dragon-like beast slain by Cadmus, the legendary founder of Thebes. The imagery here is less about wings and fire, more about coiled serpents whose watchful eyes prevented heroes from achieving their quests. The Greeks, living in a land filled with hills, caves, and winding rivers, would have often encountered snakes. The sight of one, sudden and startling, could easily inspire tales of monstrous serpents with supernatural qualities. Their myths reflect the landscape itself, rocky, unpredictable, filled with hidden dangers. The Romans inherited much of this Greek imagery, but they also lived in a broader empire where they encountered animals from across the known world. Through trade, conquest, and spectacle, Romans saw crocodiles, elephants, and strange birds from Africa and Asia. The crocodile, in particular, fascinated and unsettled them. To people unaccustomed to such a creature, it could seem like a dragon already made flesh, lurking in rivers, armored with scales, and able to drag a person beneath the water. Accounts from travelers and soldiers returning from Egypt fed Roman imaginations, and it was not difficult for their minds to merge these sites with their inherited tales of draconic beasts. In Roman art, you sometimes see these hybrid creatures represented, part snake, part lion, part something else. Each variation carried with it both fear and awe. Meanwhile, far to the east, dragons took on a very different form. In Chinese mythology, dragons were not simply monsters but powerful symbols of good fortune, imperial authority, and cosmic balance. They were creatures of the air and water, associated with rain and rivers, with the turning of the seasons. A dragon in China was long and serpentine, adorned with whiskers, often depicted as having the head of a camel, the scales of a fish, the claws of an eagle, and the horns of a deer. It was not a beast to be slain, but one to be revered. To understand this, one must consider the centrality of rivers in Chinese civilization, especially the Yellow River and the Yangtze. Both could nourish life with fertile soil, but both could also destroy with floods. The dragon, as a master of water, represented this duality, controlling both prosperity and disaster. People offered prayers to dragons to bring rains at the right times, and emperors styled themselves as dragons incarnate, rulers who held the mandate of heaven. If you imagine the festivals where dragon imagery came to life, such as the long parades where enormous dragon puppets twist and sway, carried by lines of people, you begin to see how deeply embedded this creature became in culture. The dragon was not just a tale told around a hearth, it was woven into the very rhythms of seasonal life. The agricultural cycles dependent on timely rains were linked to the favor of these beings. Over time, the dragon became not only a myth but also a kind of cultural shorthand for harmony, longevity, and power. And yet even here, the form of the dragon is flexible, sometimes depicted with wings, other times without, sometimes a fierce guardian, other times a benevolent spirit. In Northern Europe, stories of dragons came to be associated with treasure hoards and heroic battles. In Norse mythology, there is the tale of Fafnir, a dwarf transformed into a dragon by greed. He lay upon his gold, poisoning the land around him, until he was slain by the hero Sigurd. This image of the dragon curled atop treasure became enduring in European thought. Gold, difficult to mine, easily hoarded, and capable of corrupting those who possessed it, paired naturally with the dragon as a symbol. The dragon became not only a monster, but also a metaphor for the dangers of greed. Imagine the cold landscapes of Scandinavia, the forests and mountains where treasures might be buried or hidden. The dragon lurking there was a creature of imagination that made sense of both natural danger and human temptation. Across the British Isles, dragons also appeared in local legends. The Red Dragon of Wales, for example, became a national symbol, tied to prophecies and political allegories. According to one legend, the Red Dragon fought with a White Dragon, their battle shaking the land until the Red Dragon prevailed, symbolizing the triumph of the native people over invaders. Even today, that Red Dragon stands on the flag of Wales, a reminder of myth turned into enduring identity. In Anglo-Saxon England, the most famous dragon story comes from the Epic of Beowulf, where an aged hero faces a dragon threatening his people. This dragon is destructive, burning villages, and in the end, Beowulf dies from his wounds, though the dragon is slain. The tale blends heroism with mortality, suggesting that even the greatest of leaders cannot ultimately triumph over the forces of destruction. As these stories traveled, they changed shape, blending with local customs and beliefs. Medieval bestiaries, those great illustrated catalogues of animals both real and imagined, often included dragons. They were described in ways that blurred observation with imagination. A dragon might be noted as having wings like a bat, claws like an eagle, a serpent's tail, and a roar that could be heard for miles. These books were not intended as scientific records in the modern sense, but as moral texts, where each creature carried symbolic lessons. The dragon might be described as the devil incarnate, its fire representing sin, its treasure representing worldly temptation. When monks copied these texts, they illuminated the pages with vivid colors, gilded scales shimmering under candlelight. The dragon here was both a teaching tool and an artistic flourish. The presence of dragon myths in such diverse cultures raises the question of why humans invented them at all. Part of the answer may lie in the natural world. Fossils of large prehistoric animals were sometimes found by ancient people. In parts of China, fossilized bones of dinosaurs were uncovered and thought to be the remains of dragons. Ground into powders, these dragon bones were used in traditional medicine for centuries. In Greece, where earthquakes might expose the bones of mammoths or other large animals, people interpreted them as remnants of giants or monsters. Without a framework of paleontology, it made sense to link such finds to the creatures already alive in myth. A large tooth, a massive bone, a fragment of skull, these were tangible proofs of the stories told. Even the landscape itself could suggest dragons. A winding river resembles the body of a serpent when viewed from above. A mountain range might be described as the spine of a sleeping beast. Volcanic eruptions with fire and smoke pouring from the earth easily lent themselves to images of dragons breathing flame. People observing these phenomena, lacking modern explanations, filled the gaps with creatures that embodied the power and unpredictability of the world around them. To imagine a dragon slumbering beneath a mountain is a way of making sense of earthquakes. To picture a dragon flying across the sky is to imagine an explanation for storms and lightning. In daily life, the dragon also slipped into more mundane roles. In Europe, taverns and inns often bore signs of dragons, sometimes painted on wooden boards, sometimes carved into stone. A dragon inn might simply mean a place of safety or strength, borrowing the image for commercial use. In Asia, dragon motifs decorated pottery, robes, and jewelry. To wear the dragon was to draw on its protective power. Even in households, images of dragons appeared on charms and amulets, meant to guard against misfortune. The creature that began as a myth of chaos and cosmic struggle was gradually woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. You might imagine a medieval household, a fire burning in the hearth, with children listening as an elder recounts a tale of St. George and the dragon. The story, told and retold across Europe, presents the saint as a noble knight slaying a dragon that terrorized a town. Often the tale includes the detail that the dragon demanded sacrifices of maidens, and George's victory saved the latest intended victim. Over time, this story became not only a religious allegory of good defeating evil, but also a piece of cultural theatre, depicted in plays, festivals, and church art. In paintings, George appears on horseback, his spear piercing the dragon's side, the princess looking on. The dragon here became less about chaos itself and more about a moral lesson, its form standardized into the winged, fire-breathing beast that persists in modern imaginations. Yet, the dragon never lost its ambiguity. In some places it was benevolent, in others malevolent, in some traditions it was vast and serpentine, in others squat and winged. What remains constant is the human need to shape fears, hopes, and the unknown into forms that can be told as stories. Dragons in all their variations reveal less about the animals they might resemble and more about the people who invented them. They tell us what societies feared, what they valued, what they sought to explain. When you trace their history, you see the evolution not of a creature but of human imagination itself, winding like the body of a dragon across continents and centuries. You might imagine that when people in the distant past first looked upon the natural world, they saw shapes and movements that lent themselves easily to story. A coiled snake basking in the sun, a sudden flash of wings overhead, or the distant rumble of thunder rolling across hills could all inspire thoughts of unseen powers. Dragons, as one of the most persistent mythical figures across so many cultures, embody these impressions. Their presence in tales is not just as monsters but as reflections of landscapes, fears, and hopes. The dragon is a mirror for the unknown, shaped differently by each society that dreamed of it. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where cities like Babylon and Ur grew along the slow, life-giving rivers, people created myths that wove together nature and divinity. The myth of Tiamat, preserved in the Mythologies, presents a dragon-like goddess of the salt sea. Her body, immense and serpentine, represented primordial chaos. When the storm god Marduk rose against her, he split her body in two, one half forming the heavens, the other half the earth. In this myth, the dragon is not simply a beast to be feared, but the very substance of creation. The people who told these stories lived close to rivers that could nourish them with fertile silt, yet also drown entire fields when they overflowed. To them, chaos was not abstract. It was water rising beyond control, or a sandstorm blotting out the sun. The dragon, as a creature of cosmic disorder, embodied those realities. Traveling west, you encounter the Greek imagination, where the word drakon comes into play. It did not at first mean a creature with wings and claws, but rather any enormous serpent with a piercing gaze. Many Greek myths involve such beings. In the tale of Jason, the golden fleece was guarded by a sleepless dragon that coiled around the sacred tree. In the founding story of Thebes, Cadmus slew a great serpent and planted its teeth in the ground, from which sprang armed warriors. In the tale of Heracles, one of his labors was to defeat the Hydra, a serpent with many heads that grew back when cut. Each of these stories carries symbolic layers. The dragon or serpent is often a guardian, keeping humans from seizing divine or precious objects. It is also a test, a challenge that heroes must face to prove their worth. The Greeks did not imagine these beasts in isolation. They lived among real serpents, vipers, constrictors, and harmless snakes alike, which would have been familiar presences in the rocky hills and olive groves. A sudden rustle in dry leaves, or the sight of a snake stretched along a sunlit rock, could inspire a sense of awe or dread. And in their temples, where rituals unfolded by flickering torchlight, a coiled serpent might seem a natural symbol of vigilance, of eternity, or of hidden danger. The myths reflect this connection. The drakon was not far removed from daily encounters, only magnified in size and power until it became the stuff of legend. The Romans inherited these tales, as they inherited much else from Greek culture, but the empire widened their vision. A Roman citizen in the city might attend games at the Colosseum and see exotic animals brought from Africa: lions, leopards, crocodiles. The crocodile especially, armored in scales and capable of sudden violence, seemed to fit the image of a dragon almost exactly. Roman coins sometimes showed crocodiles to symbolize conquered Egypt, but to a common onlooker who had never traveled beyond Italy, it could also stand in for something monstrous. Roman authors described dragons that could strangle elephants with their coils, descriptions that read today more like travelers' exaggerations than zoology. Still, these accounts added new details to the evolving mental picture of what a dragon might be. Moving east again, one finds the Chinese dragon, perhaps the most enduring and revered of all. Unlike the European tradition, in China the dragon is not evil but auspicious. Its shape is long flowing, like a river or cloud. It often bears whiskers and horns, blending features of many animals: the scales of a carp, the claws of an eagle, the eyes of a demon, the antlers of a deer. This composite creature symbolizes balance, not destruction. It is a bringer of rain, essential for crops, and a sign of imperial power. Emperors sat upon the dragon throne. Palaces were decorated with dragon motifs. To wear a robe embroidered with dragons was to claim authority sanctioned by heaven itself. This reverence is connected to the land itself. The Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow, could shift course and flood disastrously, yet its waters made the soil fertile. To see water as under the command of dragons was to frame the natural cycle of life and death in a way both fearful and hopeful. In villages, farmers would pray to dragons for gentle rains. Festivals brought the dragon to life through long, colorful processions. One can picture lines of people beneath the paper body of a dragon, swaying and weaving as drums and cymbals echoed through narrow streets. In those moments, the dragon was not a terrifying beast but a communal protector, carrying blessings through the crowd. Elsewhere in Asia, similar beings appear with local variations. In Japan, dragons are often water deities, protectors of shrines and lakes. In Vietnam, the dragon is associated with the origin of the people themselves, a mythical ancestor. These stories demonstrate how the dragon's form adapts easily, shaped by geography and cultural needs. Where water was vital, dragons ruled rivers. Where mountains loomed, dragons dwelled in caves. The form bends to fit the landscape, yet remains recognizable across distance. In the north of Europe, dragons acquired a more sinister role. In the sagas of the Norse, there is Fafnir, once a dwarf, transformed into a dragon by greed. He guarded a treasure hoard in the wilderness, his breath poisonous. Sigurd, the hero, slew him and tasted his blood, which gave him the power to understand the speech of birds. This story reflects a different moral lesson. The dragon is greed personified, destructive not because of hunger, but because of obsession with wealth. The cold northern landscapes, with their mountains and deep forests, made the idea of hidden treasure believable, and the dragon's presence over it suggested that great riches always come at great danger. In Britain, dragon myths took root as well. The red dragon of Wales, locked in combat with a white dragon, came to symbolize the struggle of native Britons against invading forces. Geoffrey of Monmouth, a medieval chronicler, popularized this story, and from there the red dragon became a national emblem. In England, stories of dragons often connected to saints and heroes. St. George's tale is the most famous, presenting the dragon as a symbol of evil, defeated by Christian virtue. Medieval churches displayed this image in stained glass and sculpture. It became an accessible story for villagers, illustrating the triumph of faith over fear. In the poem of Beowulf, the dragon makes its most famous English appearance. Unlike the monsters of his youth, Beowulf faces the dragon in his old age. After ruling as a wise king, the dragon, disturbed when a single cup is stolen from its hoard, ravages the land. Beowulf confronts it with courage, but though he slays it, he is mortally wounded. The tale reminds listeners that even the greatest leaders cannot escape mortality. The dragon here is less a creature of nature than a final reckoning, a force of inevitability. Its treasure, bright but cursed, underscores the futility of earthly wealth in the face of death. If you consider medieval Europe more broadly, you find dragons not just in stories but also in manuscripts. Bestiaries, those elaborate collections of animal lore, regularly included dragons. They described them as the largest of serpents, with wings, claws, and fiery breath. These descriptions often drew from earlier Greek and Roman sources, but the medieval imagination added moral interpretation. The dragon represented Satan, tempting humans with wealth, burning them with sin, and ultimately to be overcome by Christ or the saints. Illuminated illustrations depicted dragons in vivid colors, their scales painted with gold leaf. For a monk copying texts in a dimly lit scriptorium, the dragon was a canvas for artistic play, as much as for moral instruction. The real world also provided hints and reinforcements for these stories. Fossils of large animals, unearthed accidentally by farmers or exposed by erosion, were interpreted as dragon bones. In China, such fossils were ground into powder and used in traditional medicine, reinforcing the belief that dragons were not only real but physically present in the earth. In Europe, mammoth bones might be found in caves, and their sheer size made them easy to imagine as remains of dragons. Without the science of paleontology, these finds became proof of the legends, each bone a relic of some monstrous beast once slain or still lurking unseen. Even the shapes of landscapes encouraged such thoughts. A river winding across the plains looked like a sleeping serpent. A ridge of mountains appeared as a dragon's spine. Volcanic eruptions with smoke and fire spewing from craters seemed like a dragon's breath bursting from the earth. To people without modern geology, the idea of dragons sleeping beneath the land was a natural explanation. In this way, myth became a tool for understanding and perhaps taming the frightening unpredictability of nature. Daily life, too, carried traces of dragons. In European towns, inns and taverns often bore names like the Green Dragon or the Dragon's Head. Painted signs displayed coiled beasts welcoming weary travelers. These were less about fear and more about recognition, a familiar symbol promising warmth and food within. In Asia, the dragon adorned robes, ceramics, and architecture. To drink tea from a cup painted with dragons, or to walk beneath a roof ridge carved with their shapes, was to invite their protective influence. The dragon became part of the visual language of daily existence, no longer distant in myth but present in small comforts and surroundings. When stories were told by firelight, a grandmother's voice slow and steady, children leaning against each other as the flames flickered, the dragon was a constant guest. St. George's lance, Sigurd's sword, Beowulf's courage. Each tale reinforced values, whether bravery, piety, or caution against greed. The dragon, shifting in detail but steady in presence, allowed listeners to picture their own struggles in symbolic form. And because the stories were repeated across generations, the dragon grew ever more familiar. It was not only a creature of imagination, but also a shared cultural inheritance, binding communities together through narrative. And yet, the dragon's image never fully hardened. It remained flexible, ambiguous, sometimes a protector, sometimes a destroyer, sometimes cosmic, sometimes domestic. That flexibility ensured its survival. Unlike a fixed symbol, the dragon could always be reshaped to new circumstances. It could frighten children into obedience, reassure farmers of rain, or inspire rulers to claim divine right. Its coils wrapped easily around whatever a society most valued or feared. If you turn your attention from the distant origins of dragon stories toward the medieval and early modern world, you find that these creatures became even more deeply embedded in daily life, ritual, and imagination. The early centuries of the Middle Ages were marked by instability, shifting kingdoms, and the slow rebuilding of social structures after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. In that setting, myths were not simply entertainment. They were vehicles for meaning, explanations of natural dangers, and teaching tools for moral lessons. Dragons thrived in this atmosphere, their imagery both terrifying and familiar. In illuminated manuscripts created in monasteries, dragons appear in margins, coiled among decorative letters, or twined around scenes of saints and kings. Sometimes they are drawn with fearsome care, scales and wings rendered in detail. At other times they are whimsical, half-playful creatures biting their own tails or sprouting from unlikely places. To a monk sitting at a wooden desk, laboring over vellum in dim candlelight, the dragon was both symbol and ornament. It gave shape to the invisible forces of sin, temptation, and danger, yet it also provided space for artistic invention. Each scribe, within the conventions of style, could add flourishes of imagination, turning the dragon into a personal mark as much as a cultural one. Medieval bestiaries, those great catalogues of known and imagined animals, described dragons with a blend of seriousness and fantasy. They were said to live in far-off lands, especially in India and Ethiopia, places distant enough to allow imagination free rein. Their bodies were enormous, their breath fiery, their tails capable of crushing animals and men alike. Yet these books were not zoological texts in the modern sense. They were moral encyclopedias. Each creature, whether lion or ant or dragon, carried a lesson about human behavior and divine order. The dragon represented the devil, whose snares could entrap the soul. Its hoard of treasure represented worldly wealth that could corrupt. Its fiery breath represented sin's consuming nature. To read about dragons in such a text was to be reminded of spiritual vigilance, as much as to be entertained by vivid descriptions. The popular story of St. George and the Dragon reflects this moral pattern. Although versions of the tale vary, the core is consistent. A town was terrorized by a dragon that demanded sacrifices, often said to be maidens offered to appease it. When George arrived, he faced the beast, subdued it, and slew it, freeing the town and saving the intended victim. In Christian readings, the dragon symbolized Satan, while George represented faith and courage, but the story also served a theatrical role. In festivals, pageants would reenact the battle, giving villagers a spectacle of good conquering evil. Paintings, sculptures, and stained glass spread the image of the knight thrusting his spear into the dragon's body. Over time, the tale shaped expectations of what a dragon should look like: winged, fire-breathing, menacing, yet conquerable by virtue. At the same time, stories of local dragons flourished across Europe. In France, the Tarasque was said to haunt the region of Provence. A dragon-like creature with a lion's head, a turtle's shell, and 6 legs. According to legend, it was tamed not by force but by the prayers of Saint Martha, who calmed it until villagers were able to kill it. This tale again emphasizes moral strength over physical might. In other places, dragons were linked to natural features. A cave near a village might be said to be the dwelling of a dragon, or a strange rock formation might be explained as the remains of its petrified body. In this way, myth merged with geography. Each community could claim its own dragon story, anchoring the universal myth in local soil. Dragons also made their way into heraldry. On coats of arms, banners, and seals, dragons symbolized ferocity, vigilance, and strength. The red dragon of Wales became a lasting emblem, while in other regions dragon imagery served noble families as a mark of power. To display a dragon on a shield was to declare a kind of kinship with that force, both feared and respected. Carvings of dragons on church pillars, tapestries, or even everyday objects like pottery suggest that the creature was never far from the medieval imagination. Whether feared as a demon, admired as a symbol of power, or enjoyed as a decorative flourish, the dragon had become a fixture. One might pause here to consider why dragons flourished in this age of castles, knights, and monasteries. Part of the answer lies in the atmosphere of uncertainty. Disease, famine, and war were frequent. Natural disasters like floods or fires could devastate a community without warning. Dragons provided a language for these dangers, personifying them in a form that could be told about, confronted, and at least in story, defeated. The battle against a dragon mirrored the battle against misfortune. The victory of saint or hero over the beast mirrored the hope of spiritual or social triumph. Dragons allowed people to imagine that chaos could be named and overcome. It is also worth considering the interplay between myth and travel. As trade routes expanded, travelers brought back accounts of strange creatures from distant lands. Some were real, crocodiles, large snakes, or monitor lizards. Others were exaggerated beyond recognition. A report of a python could grow, in the telling, into a dragon hundreds of feet long. Descriptions of foreign landscapes added to the imagery. Volcanoes in Iceland, or storms at sea, could be interpreted through the lens of dragon power. In this way, stories were not only inherited from ancient texts but continually refreshed by new impressions of the world. Dragons were not always purely destructive in these medieval tales. Some were wise, even benevolent. In certain stories from Eastern Europe, dragons guarded springs or lakes, and while they might demand respect or offerings, they were not always portrayed as malicious. The Slavic figure of Zmej, for instance, could be either a protector or a threat, depending on the story. Sometimes these dragons even interacted with humans in more complex ways, appearing as lovers or helpers. This ambiguity reflects the broader theme. Dragons were versatile symbols, capable of shifting according to what a community needed from them. One fascinating detail is the way dragons appeared in alchemy and natural philosophy. Medieval alchemists often drew dragons as emblems of transformation. A dragon devouring its own tail, known as the Ouroboros, represented the cycle of death and rebirth, dissolution and renewal. In alchemical texts, dragons symbolized the base materials of the earth, dangerous and chaotic, which through careful processes could be transformed into gold or into spiritual enlightenment. Here, the dragon was not merely an external enemy, but also a symbol of inner struggle, the raw instincts or impurities within the human soul that needed refinement. If you imagine an alchemist's workshop, shelves lined with jars of powders, a furnace glowing with slow heat, manuscripts filled with strange symbols, you can picture how the dragon fit into that world. It represented the dangerous power hidden in matter itself, a power that could destroy if mishandled, but could also yield great rewards if mastered. The dragon, in this context, was less a beast in the outside world, and more a metaphor for the process of change, both material and spiritual. Dragons also appeared in medieval maps, those sprawling depictions of the world filled with both geography and imagination. On the edges of known lands, mapmakers sometimes drew dragons or sea serpents. The phrase "here be dragons," though not common, reflects the idea that beyond the familiar lay dangers unknown. To depict dragons at the margins was to acknowledge human ignorance, to fill the blank spaces with creatures that embodied uncertainty. For a sailor setting out across the sea, stories of dragons might not have been literal expectations but served as reminders of real risks, storms, shipwrecks, or hostile encounters. In literature, dragons continued to hold an important place. Beyond Beowulf, later medieval romances often included dragon battles as tests of knightly valor. These episodes were less about zoology than about chivalric ideals. A knight proved his courage not by defeating ordinary foes but by facing the most fearsome of beasts. The dragon thus reinforced codes of honor and bravery, giving narrative shape to the values that knights were supposed to embody. Even in architecture, traces of dragons appear. Gargoyles carved onto cathedrals sometimes take draconic form, their mouths channeling rainwater away from the stone. Whether grotesque or majestic, these figures served both practical and symbolic purposes. They reminded viewers of lurking evils, yet they also displayed the skill of craftsmen. To walk beneath such a building was to be surrounded by stone embodiments of myth, watching from above as silent guardians. By the late Middle Ages, dragons had become so woven into cultural life that they appeared in plays, sermons, festivals, and even legal language. A dispute might be described metaphorically as a dragon to be slain. A political rival could be likened to such a beast. The imagery was flexible enough to carry many meanings, all grounded in the shared assumption that everyone knew what a dragon was, even if the details varied. As Europe passed through the Renaissance and into the Age of Exploration, the image of the dragon shifted once again. The printing press ensured that stories once limited to manuscripts now reached a wider audience, while voyages across the seas brought encounters with animals that were unfamiliar to Europeans. These encounters did not erase the dragon, but reshaped it, blending new knowledge with old imagination. In this period, dragons straddled a curious boundary. They remained figures of folklore and morality, yet they also entered the discourse of science, natural history, and global curiosity. Naturalists of the 16th and 17th centuries often included dragons in their compendiums. To modern readers, the mixture can seem strange. Lions, elephants, crocodiles, and then in the same serious tone, descriptions of dragons. Some of these accounts leaned heavily on tradition, repeating details from earlier bestiaries. Others attempted to rationalize the stories, suggesting that dragons were exaggerated versions of snakes, or that reports of them came from distant lands not yet fully known. Illustrations often showed winged reptiles with bat-like membranes stretched across their arms, bodies armored in scales, and tails ending in barbed points. These images borrowed heavily from classical and medieval patterns, yet they were given new life in printed books that circulated widely. Explorers and sailors added to the mix with their own reports. Returning from voyages to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they told of immense serpents, crocodiles, and lizards. The iguana, with its spiny back, seemed strange enough to be described as a kind of dragon. The Komodo dragon, though not known to Europeans until later, has since provided a living model of what such a creature might look like. But even the animals encountered in the 16th century were sufficient to reinforce belief. A crocodile displayed in a European city was not merely a curiosity. To many it was proof that dragon tales had some basis in reality. The boundaries between myth and natural history blurred. In popular imagination, however, the dragon did not lose its symbolic force. Tales of knights and saints continued to be retold, often in simpler forms accessible to common audiences. Broadsheets with woodcut illustrations showed dramatic scenes of dragon battles, sometimes accompanied by brief verses. These were sold cheaply, pinned to walls, or read aloud in taverns. For villagers and townspeople, the dragon remained a vivid emblem of danger and triumph. It was part of the shared vocabulary of storytelling, needing no elaborate explanation. In architecture, the dragon found new roles as well. Carvings of dragons appeared not only on churches but also on civic buildings, fountains, and bridges. Sometimes they were purely decorative, curling across stone in intricate patterns. At other times they had symbolic purpose, reminding viewers of vigilance or power. In some cities, dragon statues were placed as guardians of gates, watching over the movement of people and goods. The presence of such figures suggests that the dragon had become a versatile emblem, equally at home in sacred and secular spaces. In Asia, dragons retained their place as benevolent forces. The Ming dynasty in China used dragon imagery extensively, with emperors claiming the dragon as their personal symbol. Dragon motifs covered robes, porcelain, and official seals. In festivals, elaborate dragon dances filled streets with color and movement, the long bodies of the creatures twisting as teams of performers carried them. These public celebrations made the dragon not only a mythical being but a living participant in communal joy. In Japan, dragons appeared in temple carvings and paintings, often depicted alongside clouds and waves, emphasizing their connection to water and sky. In Vietnam, the dragon was linked to the nation's origins, the people said to descend from a dragon lord and a fairy mother. In all these places, the dragon was a positive force, a symbol of vitality, prosperity, and harmony. One can pause here to consider the striking divergence between East and West. In Europe, by the 17th century, the dragon was often a beast to be slain, a foe to be conquered in story or allegory. In Asia, it was revered and celebrated. These differences are not accidental, they reflect contrasting ways of understanding the relationship between humanity and nature. In Europe, with its emphasis on conflict, conquest, and the taming of the natural world, the dragon became an adversary. In Asia, where balance and harmony were emphasized in philosophy and cosmology, the dragon became a mediator, a bringer of order. Both views stem from genuine experience of natural forces, yet they shaped the creature in opposite directions. In literature, dragons continued to evolve. The Renaissance love of classical sources brought renewed attention to Greek and Roman tales, where dragons were often serpent-like guardians. Writers adapted these older forms, blending them with medieval traditions. Later, during the Enlightenment, skepticism grew. Philosophers and naturalists began to question whether dragons had ever existed. Voltaire, with his characteristic irony, mocked the persistence of belief in such creatures. Yet even as intellectuals doubted, the dragon remained popular in art and popular culture. The very act of questioning whether dragons were real kept them alive in conversation. Meanwhile, in the Americas, indigenous cultures had their own dragon-like figures. The feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, though distinct from European dragons, shares similar qualities as a hybrid creature embodying cosmic forces. Quetzalcoatl was associated with wind, learning, and creation, not with destruction. To the Aztecs and earlier peoples, the feathered serpent was a central deity, a mediator between heaven and earth. In the Andes too, serpentine figures appear in art and myth. These examples remind us that the impulse to imagine serpentine dragon-like beings is not limited to a few regions but arises again and again, shaped by different needs and values. In the daily lives of early modern Europeans, dragons remained a familiar motif. In still bore dragon names, tavern signs showed coiled beasts, and guild emblems sometimes included dragons as marks of strength. Household objects from plates to embroidery displayed dragon patterns. These uses suggest that the dragon was no longer confined to distant tales, but woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. A person might drink ale beneath a sign of a dragon, eat from a plate painted with its likeness, and hear sermons warning of the dragon as a figure of sin, all within a single day. The creature was everywhere, its presence so normal that it scarcely required notice. The fascination with dragons also intersected with medicine. In China, so-called dragon bones, actually fossils of ancient animals, were ground into powders used in remedies. Believed to carry potent properties, these fossils linked the myth of the dragon with practical healing. In Europe too, strange bones unearthed from the earth were often thought to be remains of dragons or giants. Villagers might point to a massive femur or skull fragment as evidence of a monster once slain nearby. Such finds reinforced belief, anchoring myths in the soil itself. The landscape became a witness to the stories, its hidden depths offering up bones that seemed to prove the reality of dragons. The dragon also entered heraldry and political rhetoric in new ways. Military orders sometimes adopted dragons as emblems, signaling fearlessness and strength. Political pamphlets might describe rivals as dragons to be defeated. The image remained flexible, useful for whatever meaning needed emphasis. To call someone a dragon could be an insult or a compliment, depending on context. In either case, the shared understanding of what a dragon represented made the metaphor powerful. By the 18th century, as science advanced further, dragons began to retreat into the realm of legend. Fossils were increasingly recognized not as remains of dragons, but as evidence of prehistoric animals. Naturalists classified reptiles and studied them with growing accuracy. Yet even as the dragon lost its place in natural history, it flourished in folklore, literature, and art. Children's stories featured dragons as both terrifying foes and comical figures. Operas and plays staged dragon battles with elaborate effects. The creature, though no longer taken as fact, remained essential as symbol and story. In Asia, however, belief in dragons did not fade in the same way. They continued to serve as emblems of imperial power and cultural identity. Dragon dances, dragon motifs on clothing and porcelain, and dragon symbols in temples kept the creature alive as a vital part of tradition. Even today, the dragon remains a central figure in Chinese New Year celebrations, embodying prosperity and joy. The continuity is striking. While European dragons became creatures of fantasy and children's tales, Asian dragons remained woven into serious cultural life. One might imagine standing in a European city square in the 18th century, hearing a storyteller describe a dragon slain by a knight. The crowd listens with enjoyment, but no expectation of truth. Then picture standing in a Chinese town during New Year, watching a dragon dance sway through the streets, drums echoing in the air. There, the dragon is not entertainment alone, but a living emblem of blessing. The contrast reveals how myths adapt, how the same form can mean different things depending on context. In both cases, however, the dragon endured. It adapted to skepticism, to science, to changing political realities. It was too useful, too vivid a symbol to vanish. By the end of the early modern period, dragons had shifted positions. In Europe, they were creatures of fantasy, moral allegory, and entertainment. In Asia, they were symbols of harmony, power, and celebration. In the Americas, they blended with indigenous traditions of serpentine deities. Across the globe, the dragon remained, its form flexible enough to persist in every cultural shift. As the medieval world gradually gave way to the early modern period, dragon myths continued to evolve. Printing presses spread books more widely, and with them the old stories gained new life in woodcut illustrations and popular pamphlets. Dragons appeared not only in serious theological or philosophical works but also in the realm of folklore printed for common readers. A villager who might never have seen a manuscript bestiary could now encounter an image of a dragon on a cheaply printed broadsheet, pinned to a tavern wall. The creature remained at once fearsome and familiar, a shared symbol that required no explanation. Some of these stories claimed to be accounts of real encounters. Reports circulated of dragons sighted in forests or marshes, usually described in terms borrowed from older tales. These reports were not necessarily believed by all, but they persisted because they spoke to ongoing anxieties. A fire in the countryside, unexplained animal deaths, or even the frightening appearance of a large snake might be attributed to a dragon. For people accustomed to finding moral lessons in natural events, the dragon continued to function as a convenient explanation. It is worth remembering that the boundary between natural history and mythology was not firm in this era. A single text might describe lions and elephants alongside unicorns and dragons, all given the same level of seriousness. Meanwhile, dragon imagery remained a favorite subject in art. Painters of the Renaissance took up the story of St. George with renewed vigor, placing the knight in elaborate armor, the princess in flowing gowns, and the dragon in fantastical forms. Sometimes the beast was portrayed as reptilian, with bat-like wings and sharp claws. At other times it was more serpentine, a long coiled body twisted across the canvas. In either case, the setting was often detailed with castles, towns, and landscapes that reflected contemporary Europe more than ancient myth. These paintings remind us that the dragon was not confined to a distant past, it was continually reshaped to match the present, serving as a backdrop for ideas about virtue, courage, and faith. In literature of the time, dragons likewise maintained their hold. Chivalric romances, even as they gave way to new forms of fiction, continued to feature dragon battles as tests of honor. For example, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, written in the late 16th century, includes a famous episode in which the Red Cross Knight faces a dragon. The battle is described in elaborate poetic detail, with the dragon breathing smoke and fire, its wings stretching wide over the landscape. Spenser's dragon is not merely a monster, it is a spiritual adversary, a symbol of evil that the knight must conquer to complete his quest. The imagery of the dragon allowed poets and readers alike to imagine struggles on both physical and moral planes. One might pause to imagine how these stories reached audiences in daily life. Picture a group gathered in a village square, listening to a storyteller recount the adventures of a saint or knight. The children might lean forward eagerly, picturing the dragon's wings. The adults, meanwhile, might listen with a more reflective ear, taking in the moral lessons embedded in the tale. In both cases, the dragon offered a point of shared imagination, a figure vivid enough to engage all ages. Even if no one expected to meet such a creature in the nearby fields, the stories gave shape to ideas about danger, courage, and hope. At the same time, explorers were expanding Europe's knowledge of the world. Reports of large reptiles from Africa, Asia, and the Americas reached audiences hungry for marvels. Sailors told of iguanas, caimans, and giant snakes. To those who had never seen such creatures, the descriptions blended easily with existing images of dragons. A crocodile basking on a riverbank could be described as a dragon without stretching the imagination too far. These accounts reinforced the belief that dragons might indeed dwell in remote lands, waiting just beyond the horizon. The unfamiliar was often described in terms already known, and the dragon was one of the most enduring frames through which to understand it. Dragons also appeared in scholarly debates. Some naturalists began to question whether these creatures truly existed, while others insisted they did. In the 16th and 17th centuries, books of natural history often included chapters on dragons. Some authors repeated traditional descriptions, complete with illustrations. Others attempted to rationalize the stories, suggesting that dragons were exaggerated accounts of known animals such as crocodiles or large snakes. The discussion itself reveals how persistent the idea remained. Even as science began to reshape European thought, the dragon could not be dismissed easily. It lingered on the boundary between belief and skepticism, a creature both of imagination and of supposed report. In daily life, dragons continued to decorate objects both sacred and mundane. Church carvings showed saints triumphing over them. Decorative tapestries hung in castles depicted coiled dragons amid floral patterns. Even household items like plates, tiles, or embroidery sometimes bore their images. These uses did not necessarily suggest fear. Rather, they reflect the way dragons had become part of the visual language of culture, available for any number of purposes, moral, artistic, or simply ornamental. It is also important to notice how dragons entered the realm of politics and identity. In Wales, the red dragon remained a potent emblem, tied to prophecies and the idea of national endurance. In Eastern Europe, dragon imagery was sometimes used to represent noble families or military orders. To claim the dragon as a symbol was to align oneself with power, vigilance, and fearlessness. A banner bearing a dragon might flutter over a battlefield, not because anyone expected a dragon to appear, but because its image captured qualities that leaders wished to project. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, dragon myths continued in parallel. In East Asia, the dragon remained a positive force, celebrated in festivals, art, and imperial symbolism. The contrast between European and Asian dragons grew more pronounced over time. In Europe, the dragon was largely framed as an enemy to be slain, a representation of chaos or sin. In Asia, it remained a protector, a benefactor, and a source of cosmic balance. This difference reflects broader patterns of thought. European stories often emphasized conflict, while Asian stories emphasized harmony. The dragon, flexible in form, adapted to these differing worldviews. One might reflect here on how geography shaped these differences. In Europe, the landscape was dotted with castles, forests, and mountains, settings ripe for tales of hidden beasts and heroic battles. In China, agriculture was sustained by great rivers, whose floods could be both destructive and life-giving. The dragon as water deity fit that landscape naturally. In Japan, volcanic activity and frequent storms suggested beings of power residing in seas and mountains, and dragons took on those roles. In each case, the dragon embodied the rhythms of the environment, turning natural forces into personal figures. Even in music and performance, dragons had their place. Medieval plays often included scenes of saints battling dragons, complete with costumes and props. Audiences might see a dragon constructed of wood and cloth, belching smoke through hidden mechanisms. Such performances were not merely for entertainment, they reinforced shared stories in communal settings. The dragon, larger than life, provided spectacle as well as symbolism. Theatrical depictions allowed people to see in visible form what they had only imagined in words. The endurance of dragon myths in this period suggests that they met a deep need. They allowed people to express fears in manageable form, to visualize dangers, and to imagine victory over them. They also provided decoration, spectacle, and identity. By the end of the medieval and into the early modern period, dragons were everywhere, in books, on walls, in plays, on banners. They had become so familiar that their absence would have been stranger than their presence. By the time the modern era fully unfolded, dragons had already shifted from creatures of possible reality into creatures of imagination. Science had advanced to a point where naturalists and scholars no longer listed dragons among the animals of the earth. Fossils were increasingly recognized as evidence of long-extinct species, not remnants of mythical beasts. Yet this did not erase the dragon, rather it opened space for the creature to thrive in literature, art, and popular culture, without the burden of being treated as zoology. Dragons became freer to take on new roles, sometimes terrifying, sometimes whimsical, always adaptable. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries rediscovered medieval legends with a sense of nostalgia and fascination. Writers, poets, and artists found inspiration in the imagery of knights and dragons, castles and quests. The dragon returned not as a creature of natural history, but as a central figure in imaginative storytelling. In Gothic novels, romantic poems, and dramatic paintings, dragons embodied the sublime, that sense of awe and terror at forces greater than human control. An audience reading such works might not have believed in dragons literally, but they still responded to the emotional weight the creature carried. The dragon, even as fantasy, had the power to stir something deep. Meanwhile, folklore at the local level preserved dragon tales in villages and towns. Legends of dragon slaying lingered in oral tradition, passed down by grandparents to children. In some regions, these tales were tied to specific landmarks. A hill, a lake, or a ruined castle might be said to have once been the dwelling of a dragon. Such stories anchored the myth in place, giving communities a sense of connection to their landscape. Even if the details varied, the presence of a dragon in the story lent a touch of wonder to the ordinary. Walking past such a hill, one might remember the old tale and see the slope differently, as if some vast presence still lay beneath. As the 19th century progressed, dragons entered the realm of children's literature. Writers like Lewis Carroll, in Through the Looking Glass, gave us the Jabberwock, a dragon-like creature slain in a playful nonsense poem. In such works, dragons could be both frightening and comic, embodying the thrill of the strange without the need for theological or moral weight. Illustrators, too, delighted in depicting them, their scales and wings offering opportunities for inventive detail. For Victorian audiences, dragons became part of a broader rediscovery of fairy tales and folklore, enjoyed in print as much as in oral tradition. The rise of fantasy literature in the 20th century gave dragons new prominence. In J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, the dragon Smaug embodies many older traditions: the hoarder of treasure, the corrupter of hearts, the destructive force of greed. Smaug's presence within the story echoes the Norse saga of Fafnir, yet he is also rendered with psychological depth, his speech sly and menacing. Tolkien's dragon was not just a beast but a character, intelligent and cunning, a personality as well as a symbol. This reimagining influenced countless later depictions. C.S. Lewis, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, included a dragon transformation as part of a spiritual lesson. A boy named Eustace, greedy and selfish, becomes a dragon through his own inner corruption, and only through painful transformation does he return to human form. Here the dragon is not an external foe but an expression of inner faults. Such use of dragon imagery shows how flexible the creature had become, sometimes an enemy, sometimes a mirror. As fantasy literature flourished, so too did role-playing games and later films. Dungeons & Dragons, first published in the 1970s, placed dragons at the heart of its imagined worlds. They could be red and fiery, blue and storm-breathing, green and poisonous, gold and benevolent, each variation built on ancient traditions, while adding new layers. Dragons in such games were not simply obstacles but complex beings with personalities, goals and layers described in detail. Players could fight them, bargain with them, or even befriend them. In this way the dragon became a central figure in collaborative storytelling, not just a relic of myth but a living presence in imaginative play. Cinema also brought dragons to vivid life, from animated films like The Reluctant Dragon and How to Train Your Dragon to epic blockbusters filled with computer-generated fire. Dragons entered modern visual culture with power. In some films they remained terrifying, vast beasts to be feared. In others they became companions, loyal and even endearing. This duality echoes their ancient ambiguity. Just as some cultures revered dragons while others feared them, modern audiences have embraced both sides. A dragon can be a destroyer or a friend, depending on the story. Across the world, traditional festivals and art forms continued to celebrate dragons. In China, dragon dances remained central to New Year celebrations, their long bodies winding through crowded streets, scales glittering in bright fabric, heads snapping and swaying as drummers set the rhythm. In Japan, temples preserved dragon imagery in paintings and carvings, their forms curling among clouds or waves. In Wales, the red dragon persisted as a national emblem, flying on the flag and celebrated in cultural events. The endurance of these traditions shows how deeply the dragon has been woven into identity, far beyond the realm of fantasy literature. One might consider here how the dragon embodies human imagination itself. In its scales and wings we see the impulse to combine, to create hybrids from pieces of the natural world. In its role as enemy or ally, we see the reflection of human values, fears and hopes. In its treasure hoards and its watery realms, we see both the dangers of greed and the blessings of fertility. The dragon as an image has always been a vessel, carrying meaning across centuries. That vessel can be filled with whatever a society needs: chaos, wisdom, danger, protection. Its endurance lies in that flexibility. In the modern scientific world, the dragon is not real. Yet paleontology has shown us creatures that once lived, whose bones could easily inspire such myths. Massive dinosaurs, winged pterosaurs, giant marine reptiles. To a farmer unearthing a fossilized femur or skull, the explanation of a dragon would have been entirely reasonable. Today we know these creatures by other names, yet they continue to feed the imagination. A museum visitor, standing before the skeleton of a tyrannosaurus or a pterosaur, might feel a whisper of that ancient awe. Dragons may not exist, but something like them once did, in the deep past of the earth. In daily life today, dragons still appear everywhere. They decorate clothing, tattoos, logos and mascots. Sports teams claim them as symbols of strength. Businesses adopt them for their names. In fantasy literature, video games and films, dragons are almost unavoidable. To walk into a bookstore or to browse a streaming service is to find dozens of dragons waiting in covers and posters. The creature has become a shorthand for the magical, the powerful, the wondrous. Yet it also retains its darker side, appearing as a symbol of danger and destruction in apocalyptic tales. One could argue that dragons now exist more widely than ever before. Once confined to particular cultures and regions, they have become global. A child in one country might learn dragon tales from medieval Europe. while another delights in Chinese dragon dances, and another plays video games where dragons of all kinds appear. The global imagination has absorbed them, blending traditions into new forms. In some cases, this creates hybrids, dragons that breathe fire but also bring rain, dragons that are winged yet serpentine, drawing on both east and west. The creature has always thrived in combination, and now in a connected world, that tendency has only increased. In all these ways the dragon endures. It has passed from clay tablets in Mesopotamia to illuminated manuscripts, from festival parades to modern films, from whispered folklore to digital games. It is not one creature but many, not one meaning but countless. To trace its path is to trace human imagination itself, winding through time like the body of the dragon, coiling and uncoiling, always present just beyond the edge of certainty. You have followed the long winding trail of dragons across centuries, across continents, and across the shifting boundaries between fear and wonder, from the earliest myths where they coiled through the waters of creation, to medieval manuscripts where they symbolized sin and virtue, to the festivals where they danced in clouds of incense and lantern light. The dragon has never been one thing alone. It has been a monster, a guardian, a benefactor, and a warning. What you might notice looking back is that the dragon has always mirrored the people who imagined it. To the farmers along the Yellow River, it was a bringer of rain. To the poets of the north, it was greed and destruction curled around piles of gold. To philosophers, it was a symbol of transformation, of chaos refined into meaning. And to modern storytellers, it has become a creature both terrifying and beloved, at once the adversary and the companion. In this sense, the dragon is not only a legend, but also a record of how human beings have tried to make sense of the world. Where there were storms, floods, and fires, there were dragons. Where there were unexplained bones in the earth, there were dragons. Where there was the desire to teach courage, or to warn against greed, or to celebrate power, the dragon was always there, its form shifting to suit the lesson. And yet, even after so many centuries, the dragon still invites us to imagine. It lies just beyond certainty, waiting in the mist, in the shadows of mountains, in the margins of old books. Whether as a golden emblem on silk, a carved stone gargoyle, or a figure in a child's bedtime story, it continues to rest beside us quietly, reminding us that the boundary between the real and the imagined is softer than it seems. So as you drift away now, you might hold on to the thought that every culture has breathed life into its own version of the dragon, and in doing so, has left us a mirror of itself. The dragon belongs everywhere, and nowhere, always changing, never gone. It is as ancient as creation myths, and as modern as the stories still being written tonight. And with that, the tale of dragons slowly closes, not with fire and fury, but with a gentle acknowledgement that they live on wherever stories are told, whenever the mind needs a shape for mystery. Like the steady rhythm of your own breathing, the dragon remains, unhurried, eternal, always ready to rise again in imagination. If you found this quiet journey through dragon legends comforting, you might consider returning here again whenever you'd like more calm stories to fall asleep to. There are many more legends waiting, some familiar, some forgotten, all told in the same slow and steady rhythm. If you'd like to hear them, you're always welcome to subscribe to Restful Legends. It's a simple way to keep these gentle stories close at hand. For now, let the day fade away, let your thoughts drift softly, and rest well.